Welcome to The Way In, where we talk to truckers about their life on the road. Welcome to the Way In podcast. My name is Robert Rouse. I'm here with Dean Croke, our principal analyst with DAT. Welcome to the podcast, Dean.
Yeah, great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to have you.
Yeah.
I know you and I have a lot of great conversations inside DAT's buildings, but wanted to really let everybody see all the cool things that we get to talk about. One of the things I wanted to start with is, where did you start in trucking? Like, where did you kind of come from?
Farm in Australia as a young boy. Mum and Dad weren't worried about the snakes as much as where are the keys to the tractor. And they'd always try and hide the keys away from us kids because as soon as we could walk, we were out on the machinery driving tractors and fooling around. We grew potatoes and had cattle. So as a byproduct of that, my father and mother had trucks to move the freight to market. So that led to a trucking business. So as a young boy on a farm, I was part of the labour pool, which sounds strange, but my dad had me in a truck. He was loading hay on the back, and it was a truck with an automatic cruise control in the old days, which was a big cable you pull out of the dash and tighten it, and that kept the truck at 5 miles an hour. But I was 6 years old and I was steering it. And, if you spend a few years doing that as a young kid, it's not that much of a stretch. But anybody that's grown up on a farm knows that if you're sort of, able to work, you are part of the work pool no matter what age you are. So by 9, I was actually driving my dad's semi on the road, not under any pressure. He would sleep and I would want to drive. So back in 1969, it was a 1418 Mercedes-Benz. So it was a German truck in a landscape where there only were American trucks, and they had no power steering. And so a power steering truck is easy to drive for a 9-year-old. The 1418 had a 5-speed synchromesh gearbox like a car and power steering. So it was really easy to drive for a young kid. So it was fairly simple for me. And I still remember he'd pull over about 2 o'clock in the night and I'd drive the last hour home, and we'd pull up in the shed and he would jump out and he'd go to bed. I'd get up and go to school at 6. And the teacher always thought I was a dreadful liar, because they'd say, what have you got for news? And I'd put my hand up and say, well, we took 300 fat lambs to Sydney markets last night. And the teacher looked at me thinking, you were such a bad liar, until she met my parents.
At 9 years old, how do you reach the pedal? Like that's.
I sat on a pillow and had a chock behind me, and I could reach the pedals. It was a wonderful experience. I remember one time we were hauling a lot of drought stock from it. There was a drought, and it's a bit like an ELD exemption. When there's a drought on, you can haul sheep and cattle away from the drought area and run as many miles as you can. About a dozen trucks from our town had been doing this over the course of a week, but it was the week before Christmas in 1972, and I was getting a brand new dragster bike that Christmas Day. And after the week was over and they'd done lots of these trips, we moved all these sheep away from danger, they all went to the pub on the way back. Because this is Outback Australia in the 70s. They went to the pub on the way home. And, of course, after a week of no sleep and work, they got back in the trucks and we started driving. And one by one, they'd pull up, too tired, couldn't drive any further. I said, Dad, we got to get home because I know what's happening tomorrow. I know where the bike is. And he said, well, I can't drive. I said, move over. And I drove through some of the most mountainous territory Australia's got on a dirt road to get home. And I never forget that. But that was sort of just part of growing up as a kid in Australia. That wasn't unusual for a lot of kids my age back then.
What part of Australia was it in?
So inland from Sydney, about 350, 400 miles. It's kind of on the edge of where the Outback starts. The Outback starts once you get up over the plateau outside of Sydney, and it's fairly flat all the way, but it becomes almost desert by the time you get inland. It's kind of the line where you can start hooking up 2 trailers. You go a little bit further, you can hook 3 up. So there's a sort of an imaginary line where you can hook multiple trailers up the further you get inland where the population's less.
So because I've seen some crazy pictures of kind of how they work in Australia, and it's a little bit different. So like you showed me one photo where you had 4, what's kind of the rule set around there, and kind of why do they allow that where we don't get that in the States?
So Australia is the landmass the size of the United States. The furthest haul is Boston to San Diego. We used to do that in 43 hours with air freight back in the 80s. So there's nothing in between though. Right. So there's no truck stops to speak of. Well, there's one, right? And you might stop there and fuel up. But so there's not much infrastructure. So, and there's not much population. 80% of the population lives in 3% of the landmass in Australia. So it makes the freight task enormous between population centres. Yeah. There's a massive population on the West Coast and most of the people live on the East Coast. So economically, it doesn't make sense to have one truck at a time hauling one trailer. The economics just don't work. So, and because there's no population to speak of and there's no traffic on the roads, there's nothing to stop you putting 3 or 4 trailers on. You do need special equipment. You need to be licensed. The truck's got to be rated. The difference in Australia, the reason why you do that, because here we're paid by the mile, right. So there's kind of a disincentive to put more trailers on, because more weight doesn't necessarily give you any more revenue unless you restructure the contract. In Australia, you're paid by what you haul, so the more by the pallet space. So that's why all the trucks are cab over, because a truck with a hood takes away 4 pallet spaces on the trailer. And the regulations are bumper to bumper, front to back, not here where it's the 5th wheel to the middle of the back axle on the trailer.
Yeah.
And you can have anything you want out the front. In Europe and Australia, it's bumper to bumper, so everything is squashed up on the cab and the trailer is maximised for revenue purposes.
Obviously you're driving long distances. You do that, like you just said, here in the States. But when you're going from Boston to San Diego, there's lots of spots in between those 2 areas, where you can stop and, get your truck worked on and do all that kind of stuff. How is it different in Australia?
So first of all, hours of service, you can run 18 hours a day, right?
That's a long time.
But it's not a prescriptive 24-hour focus. It's on a 2-week block. So you might have 168 hours. So you work your hours in around how the freight flows. You might do 14 hours one day, and then the next day you've got to cut it back, right? So that's the first thing. You've got a lot more time to do a lot more work. The magic part of it is you've got to have 6 hours continuous sleep every 24, but you can have it whenever you want, which is perfect for truckers. Yeah. So within the confines of that, you're not just a steering wheel holder. Like there's no 1-800 number to call if you blow a tyre. In our cattle road train business, we would change 4 tyres a day on average. So when you look at an Australian road train, they've got 4 tyres under each trailer, mostly, because a lot of it's on dirt. Mm-hmm. So you spend a lot of time changing tyres, so you become a very good tyre fitter. But the real difference is you're more than a driver, you're a mechanic. Yeah. If you're hauling cattle, you're a stockman. So it's more of a lifestyle as opposed to a job, because when you're 1,000 miles from civilization and you might only see 3 or 4 people a day in cars, you're on your own. So it's a survival exercise, but you've got to become a very good mechanic at fixing things that break. So you always have spare parts. You always have a whole range of fan belts, generators, all sorts of stuff you might need that breaks down. So most people know what breaks on trucks. So you've always got spare parts. You've always got a barbecue grill to pull out from under the trailer, and you've always got a cooler full of beer. That's how you get by.
I mean, that sounds like a really more stressful type of trucking than
There's nothing like pulling up in the middle of nowhere, lighting a fire, a campfire, and cooking dinner underneath the Milky Way and the stars. It's silent. Like there's no noise.
Well, there's no lights. It's just kind of
It's an amazing experience. Other than for the truck creaking as it cools down, it's just silent.
I think the biggest thing for me, I think that all sounds great, except for in Australia, everything wants to kill you. Yeah. So how do you deal with those types of things out there as well? So
there's a couple of things you don't do. You don't pull up where there's still water, because the crocodiles will come tearing out wanting to eat you. So you've got to be careful at river crossings, right? If you pull up, there's always crocodiles around there lurking. The other thing is snakes. Snakes like to lay on the blacktop to warm up in the mornings. If you don't see them come out the back of the trailer, they're wrapped around the axle for sure. I've had one experience where I've slid underneath to put a jack under it to jack up the axle, and I heard this hiss. There's a very angry snake, copperhead snake, wanting to attack me. So that was the first and only time I ever made that mistake. It was kind of a rookie mistake because people had said, be careful with snakes out there. Because the desert is really cold at night, the blacktop retains the heat. And because there's no fences in the outback, all the animals come in to feed on the green grass. So as the rain runs off the road, the grass is the greenest along the edge. So you have wild camels, you have wild horses, you have kangaroos, all feeding, and you're rolling along the road at 100 kilometres an hour or 60 miles an hour, and there's animals everywhere. So that's why you have a big bull bar on the front that's got maybe 6 posts so the animals don't go through your radiator, because a radiator through the block is like, that's the death sentence in the outback. So you have very big, heavy bull bars so that the animals don't compromise the radiator or your tyres or your lights. We used to find a way to hit them on an angle because they deflect as opposed to square on, especially a camel, a wild camel.
Yeah.
Because it's got a very big population of wild camels, because road trains in Australia were originally Afghan camels.
Really?
Yeah, when diesel power came along, they just let all the camels loose.
That's...
So it's a real hazard.
I didn't even realize that there was that many camels in
A lot, yeah. Sometimes you get so tired you wonder if you're seeing things or not, but they're real.
That's crazy. You know, one of the things that you talked about is kind of how you move freight in Australia is a little bit different. Yep. So one of the things you were talking about is, you know, fuel. You were taking fuel, and kind of, I thought that was really interesting. You know, you're taking 4 trailers full.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about that experience, because I think that was really fascinating.
So Australia doesn't have a lot of infrastructure, as in power. So when you go to the outback, there's no power lines. And one of our biggest exports is metals, iron ore, rare earth metals. So all of the mining industry is all run on diesel generation, right? And it's in remote areas on dirt roads. So and all of the outback Indigenous population live in communities that have their own diesel generation power. So if you watch Outback Truckers and you see Steve Graham, the star of that, what he's doing is servicing the remote Aboriginal communities with food and supplies 9 months of the year, because from November to March, it's the wet season where you could have 10 feet of rain. You can't go anywhere in the wet. Right. So over 9 months, you've got to move the freight into all of these communities. And because it's diesel-powered generation, you've got to stockpile all the mines and communities with distillate in 9 months to run for 12 months. So it's a really interesting freight task. Most of our distillates come in from Malaysia, Indonesia, so it comes into the top end. We don't make any of our own, diesel anymore. It always comes in, and we've got to truck it all over the country. Yeah. So it's a fairly big freight task. The difference, though, Robert, is in Australia they're a little bit more pragmatic. They don't want too many trucks on the road. That's why, for every 3 single trucks, we move the same amount of freight on 2 9-axle B trains. It's a bit like the B doubles you see, or the B trains that come out of Canada you see running up and down the I-5 here. So we've cut down the number of trucks on the road by allowing trailers to be more productive. And here in the US, there is a push for increased mass limits, but it's met with a lot of opposition. Not just, from the rail lobby who don't want trucking to get a leg up, but also within the trucking industry, there's a concern that if I put more weight on, all I'm going to do is just have more cost without a revenue offset in a free market. So in Australia, though, they have a thing called the National Heavy Vehicle Accreditation Scheme, where you can design your own truck and trailer combination in exchange for regulatory benefits. If you have telematics, so they can track you, because you can, when you run, the bigger the trailers and the more creative, you can only run on certain roads. And they geofence the roads so that if your telematics device says you're off route, you'll be in some serious trouble. So in the late 90s, we pioneered at the ATA, when I worked there, a project called TruckSafe, which is written into the FAST Act here in the US. And TruckSafe is a voluntary accreditation scheme, because if you allow carriers to get, if you can make regulations economically affordable, as opposed to punitive, they will buy in. Because if I say to you, I'm going to give you regulatory benefits and you will make more money, carry more weight, right, in exchange for this higher level of compliance, carriers say, of course I'm in. So what we did is we gave carriers, you could carry, if you opened up your books, you let our auditors come in, see how well you run your business, another 2 ton per axle group.
So, obviously things can change in the industry here in the States as well. Do you think that the introduction of automated trucking would change to allow for, are they going to try to, hey, now we can do 2 trailers, or or is there anything in that you think will shake up the industry?
It's a really tough one. I'm not confident that would allow any significant change because there's too many anti-trucking groups. Because there's the safety groups who have a very good case. If we allow trucks to be bigger and heavier, and then that creates more risk on the roads for cars. So you can see the argument there. The rail lobby won't want you to put more tons on a truck because that'll take away from their market share. So there's a lot of anti-trucking groups. The reality is, though, if you're talking about autonomous trucks, there is a role in the middle mile piece for a driver to what I call de-task, which means, because right now you have a task saturation problem in a truck where in the early hours of the morning you've got so much stuff going on, you're tired, you're trying to stay awake. If an autonomous truck could take over and allow me to relax during for an hour or so in the middle of nowhere, I think there's a role for that to play and reset my 14-hour clock. I think there's a really viable argument for that. But right now, I just don't see a way where having autonomous trucks solves any of our problems, because I've got the same model in Australia running where you take 3 trailers out to a road train hookup pad. So you've got 3 trucks running 3 trailers out in the first mile.
Right.
The road train does the middle mile with 3 trailers on. It gets to the end road train point, unhooks. You need 2 more trucks plus the road train truck to take the 3 trailers in.
Right.
Unload, reload, come back out. I know you need more drivers. This idea that autonomous trucks will require less drivers, I think it's mythical. Yeah. Because you'll need more final and initial mile drivers to move that freight around. So I think they would have more success if they were talking about driver assistance technology as opposed to this idea that somehow drivers are useless. The idea that you'll have a truck driving on its own, it boggles my mind because of all the stuff that goes wrong when you drive a truck. Like, it's hard to predict what can go wrong on the road in a truck. I mean, who triages the truck that's the autonomous truck when it breaks down? So I think the business model will be you'll have an autonomous truck with a driver, and the driver will just do different things. I think that's a viable alternative, but the idea that we'll have driverless trucks, I just don't see that being practical.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. Like even if you look at aircraft, right? Like the aircraft, as soon as you get off the ground, it pretty much flies itself most of the time until that one time it doesn't, and then that's when you need that pilot to take over.
Operating environment is changing in every nanosecond. Like, it's an incredibly challenging environment. That's why it drains your body so much of mental energy, because you're concentrating so hard on all the stuff that's going on around you. Because you're not just driving yourself, you're driving for everyone else. Because you're trying to anticipate what everyone else is doing. It's a really complex job, and it will drain your energy levels pretty quickly.
Yeah. I've only been in a truck. Obviously was never a driver or anything like that, but I've been in a truck a couple of times, riding along with our customers and being in there. And I will tell you, I've done some pretty hard jobs working in a lumber mill, 12-hour shifts, right? I've never been more tired, physically and mentally tired, than spending a week on the road with a driver. It's
the motion, the moving, the noise, the vibration. The vibration and noise really take a lot of energy out of you. It's fatiguing. And then you've got the mental fatigue from poor, inadequate, disrupted sleep.
Right.
So it's a very tough job, because if you don't get sufficient sleep, the body can't recover the physical fatigue from the bouncing around and all the work. So you degrade fairly quickly in a truck. We were talking to some folks the other day, and they showed us some data. In fact, the people from the St. Christopher's Fund, on their website, they talk about some interesting stats that the average trucker has a life expectancy 16 years less than the average population. I'd always known that we looked a lot older than we really were, but I didn't think our life expectancy was that different. I'm connected with a lot of social media people on Facebook, old Australian truck drivers, right, from the 70s and 80s when I was driving with them. You can see how it's caught up with them, and these are folks that are younger than me but look a lot older, because the trucking industry has worn them down. And the lack of medical care, the lack of health, the lack of opportunity, because you're always in a truck going somewhere in the opposite direction to where you need to be from a health perspective.
Right. Well, I think there's also a lot of, everybody has stress in their life, right? Like, I have stress, you have stress, we all have stress. The amount of stress you feel in the truck, because you are literally in an 80,000 pound killing machine that, at any point in time, if you are not on top of your game, you could put a lot of other people's lives in danger. And I think that added stress, even if you're not thinking about it, is taxing on your body.
So we did, when I worked at Omnitrax, we did predictive modeling. So one of the products we built was predicting which drivers that have an accident from data. Rate of hard braking applications, made of pay, how much cash they got each week, cash advances. There's a strong relationship between cash advances and accidents because it's a stress. Like, so I'm getting a cash advance on my fuel card because I've got problems with cash flow at home, and it distracts you from the driving task. Yeah. So we built these models to predict who was most likely to have an accident. It's wildly predictive. When we talk to drivers through our language models we built a rules engine that said if these data points are in this sequence, based on their ELD feed, their miles, their pay, their radius, all these other tenure, prior jobs, all those sorts of things, we would talk to the driver and we'd say, hey, Robert, how are you? Fairly open question. When we first started the project, the driver manager would call up and say, hey, Robert, this thing says you're going to have an accident. What's up? And, of course, the driver freaks out. So we said, no, that's not how this works.
Right.
The data's telling you that Robert's driving patterns and work patterns looks like other accidents in the past. Just call him and say, how's it going?
Right.
Open the conversation. Get good at asking open-ended questions. It always turned out that there was something at home that was going on. It was never something about the job or the truck. It was always some stresses at home. I'd missed my son's soccer game, my dentist appointment, our wedding anniversary. They've cut off our electricity. Like, there's always something at home that finds its way into the cab that causes the driver to have an elevated accident risk. And that's the challenge you've got, because you're never there to answer. You're physically not there when there's problems at home. So it's worse for drivers with teenage kids in particular. They're the most at risk. Someone with a brand new baby is not getting any sleep at all, right? So you know that's a problem. But when the kids get older, the stresses sort of change and evolve over time. And it's not until you get to where the kids are sort of left home and off to college or off to work that their life changes. So there's a cohort in the middle based on the children's age where the stress levels are through the roof, and it really causes a high degree of accidents and voluntary terminations, drivers quitting to go and work for someone else locally.
Yeah, I think that's always been a big thing in the industry is being away from home for some of these drivers are 3, 6, 7 weeks sometimes. They're not there all the time. I do, really am excited about the technology that we have today versus 20, 30 years ago, where now you can FaceTime your loved ones or connect with them in those different ways.
And you can show them how good of a singer you are on TikTok. Apparently,
that's true.
There's a lot of truckers out there that are handy singers.
That's true. The interesting thing that I love about truckers out there is they're great storytellers, right? And TikTok has been a way for drivers to really go out there and tell their stories and explain, what's going on out.
It's such a lonely world. It's your way of connecting with the outside world, because absent social media, you're isolated all the time. And truckers are not the best speakers, just one-on-one, because we're generally we're out driving a truck on our own for a very good reason. We're not necessarily socially equipped to deal with people. And that may be a little bit harsh, but the reality is the more you drive, the further you move away from mainstream commerce, because you're disconnected, and you lose the ability to communicate. I went through this for years. I would come home after a week's work and I could hardly put 2 words together. I'm so tired and I couldn't speak. I was kind of speechless. It took me a while to overcome that. So I think it's an isolating job, but I love how social media is connected. I have lots of folks that I've connected through social media that we talk all the time through DMs, and we've become good friends. I met a couple in Europe when I was over there, people that I'd never met before. So I think that's really opened up the doors for either operators and drivers to express their frustration.
Yeah.
When you watch TikTok in particular, there's a lot of negativity, but what they're really telling you, they're just expressing how they feel, and I think that's a good outlet for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about social media for a second, because you have a great social media that I know I follow, a lot of us follow, the Grumpy Pete. Talk to me about what is the Grumpy Pete? How did that get started?
So my vision was to, and still is, to write children's books about the adventures of the Grumpy Pete. But it was a way to educate parents through a book that parents would read to their kids, but the parents are learning about the trucking industry at the same time. So that's my goal. I want to educate families, but entertain kids at the same time about this cartoon character-looking black Peterbilt that travels all over the country, getting into all sorts of trouble, right? As truckers do.
Yeah.
Not bad trouble, but difficult situations. Yeah. And so I've got the book sketched out and everything. That's sort of a side project. But so I bought this black Peterbilt. How the book idea got started, I'd wanted it's an ex-Werner 379 03 model Peterbilt. So I bought it out of the Werner fleet. And I did some custom work to it, put old school headlights on it and a big 14-inch drop visor, and it looks pretty mean when you look at it from the front. And my boys at the time said, this is back in 07, said, Dad, it's a really grumpy-looking Peterbilt. And I thought, that's the name, the Grumpy Pete. So that's stuck. Now, to this day, people still call me Pete, amongst a whole range of other things, but I'm known as Pete, which I'll answer to. So it's sort of stuck. I've stuck with it. How it got started was really a bit of, I had to ask my boys in 2017, what's Instagram? Right? That was my first foray into social media. And they said, Dad, you're so old. So they schooled me on social media. And what happened, a couple of guys said to me, would you come and video my truck? Would you come and video me working? And I'd known, because I've got very little record of my driving career, because we didn't have cameras 50 years ago, right? But we didn't have iPhones until 07. So there's no record of me driving. There's a couple of grainy pictures, but there's nothing you can show and say, here's what I did. So they said, can you do a video? I thought, this is a great idea, because you can take a picture of your truck, but you can't take a video of you working to show your kids. And that was really how my page started, because it's not about me. There's a little bit of stuff about me occasionally in my truck, but 95% of the time it's all about pumping up everyone else's tires.
Yeah.
I want to make them look good, show them at their best, educate the rest of the world on what they're doing, which it does through a lot of non-trucking followers, especially those outside of the US. But it's all about the industry and trying to put a positive spin on the industry by showing truckers at work. So I'm never doing negative posts about things that go wrong, because there's some pages that are just about all the bad stuff that happens. I would never post anything about an accident or drivers doing something wrong, because we all make mistakes. Yeah. And so that's sort of my social media thing. It's just for fun, and I love doing it. I've just come back from Europe where my wife says, you're really weird, because I go to Florence to look at the history and you're looking at trucks delivering freight, or we go to Venice and she says, this is one of the most historic places and you're watching freight boats deliver frozen food to a restaurant. To me, that's the industry, because, I think this is something we need to work on. It's the final steps in the final mile. Right. That's the hardest part, because I know for sure when you go and get a degree, a supply chain degree, I know they're not talking about the final steps, because that's the hardest. It doesn't matter what truck you're driving anywhere, it's always the final steps in the supply chain that are the hardest that truckers have to do. And it's some of the most physically demanding, gut-wrenching work you could ever imagine. That's, I'm just a passionate trucker guy. It's nothing complex, but I just love logistics and moving. It's a bit like Arnold Schwarzenegger when he had, what was that ad? He said, we pick things up and we put things down. Yeah. That's kind of my simplistic supply chain analogy. Yeah,
I think the great part about the trucking industry is that, if you've been in the trucking industry, it kind of sticks to you, right? It's kind of something that I feel like once you're in the trucking industry, it's like you almost can't leave, because it's
hard to shake.
It's a cultural thing that once you feel
I tried
part
to leave.
of it,
I tried to get out of it. I stopped driving trucks and I thought, I got to get out of this. It's killing me. Right. And then I get dragged back in. Someone says, well, we need help underwriting truck fleets. Can you come and help us explain what this means on a slip? So I worked for Allianz and helped them understood how to underwrite the trucking industry in the US, in Australia, and then the US. And after a while, I thought, I need to come to terms with the fact that I'm going to be in the trucking industry all of my life. I just need to accept it gracefully instead of fighting it. And here I am at DAT Freight and Analytics, analysing the freight market every day to help truckers be more profitable. And I've kind of always been in trucking one way or the other. It's been it's been a great industry though. A lot of people criticise it, but I think this is one of the most exciting industries you can be part of, especially coming out of school. If you want to do a degree, supply chain logistics, you could work in a variety of industry verticals with that background.
So switching gears just a little bit, right? So you're one of our principal analysts. You look at the data all the time, right? So for those that aren't looking at the data all the time, what's some things that they could look at that would help them understand what's going on in the industry a little more quickly?
First thing is don't dive in and dive out. Don't just look at something once every month. You've got to be a student of this industry. You've got to follow things religiously. So find someone to watch or read or listen to and do it consistently. Because if you take our IQ show every Tuesday, I'm giving you little grains, little pictures that build this puzzle week after week after week as the market evolves. You can't look at our show, on Tuesday and say, that's the freight market, because by next Tuesday it will have changed. So you've got to be consistent with who you follow. It could be someone on LinkedIn. It could be a podcast. Podcasts are great for truckers. But I would say, the one thing I would say is you've got to study, of all the things, the demand for what you haul. It's no good talking to other truckers about their truck, right? You would need to be talking to shippers about the demand for what they make, and that's going to translate to what you haul, where you haul, and how much you haul it for. So you've got to become a student of the industry, but not of the trucking industry. You've got to become a student of the freight market that you're in.
So obviously listen to the DATIQ each Tuesday.
That's one thing, right? Yep. So we've got Freight Find podcast with Professor Kaplis. That's a lot more shipper focused, but has a lot of very interesting technology people there. I publish a market update every Tuesday night at dat.com/market update. We're on at 10 o'clock Eastern every Tuesday. We've usually got a guest on. So that's one way to do it. Some very good people on LinkedIn you can follow. So I think connecting with other professionals but doing it consistently. So watching and listening. And I think, no one person's got the answer. I think that's the most important thing. I liken it to building a jigsaw puzzle. You only get the complete picture by putting all the pieces together. And all the different players in the market have a piece of the puzzle. When you put it together, you'll be able to figure out where you need to be and when and how hard you need to negotiate.
Well, thanks, Dean, again for joining us for this conversation. We always love talking about trucking. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.